Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. The night was thick with fog, the kind that made the world feel like it was pressing in on you, heavy and suffocating. My name is Alex, and I was just trying to get home. I'd been driving for hours through the winding roads of the Appalachian Mountains, the dim headlights barely cutting through the murk. Beside me, my sister Emma scrolled through her phone, her silence more noticeable than usual. In the back seat, Chris stared out the window, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see, something that seemed to be pulling him in. The mountain roads weren't unfamiliar to me, but something about tonight felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the oppressive fog that clung to everything, or the strange, foreboding sense that we were being watched. Either way, I couldn't shake the unease. My grip tightened on the wheel as the car rumbled over the asphalt, the sound of the tires almost deafening in the silence of the car. "So you two still think this was a good idea?" I asked, trying to break the tension. I knew it was a bad idea to take this route, through the mountains away from the main highway. But Emma had insisted on taking the scenic route, and Chris had agreed. I figured it was just another one of those impulsive decisions they were both known for. "Better than the traffic we'd be stuck in on the highway," Emma muttered, not looking up from her phone. Chris didn't respond, and I stole a quick glance at him in the rearview mirror. He was slumped in his seat, his face pale and tired. The journey had been long, but that wasn't why he looked so drained. There was something else in his eyes. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then, out of nowhere, I saw him. A figure on the side of the road, standing still as a statue. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but as we got closer, it became clear. A man, tall and thin, his clothes torn and his hair wild. He was waving his arm in the air, like he was trying to get our attention, and in that moment, I had an overwhelming urge to keep driving, to pretend I hadn't seen him. But I didn't. I pulled over, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see past the end of the car. The man approached us, his steps slow but purposeful. I wasn't sure why I didn't just drive off. He looked wrong somehow. But before I could make up my mind, he opened the passenger door and slid in next to Emma without a word. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse, almost like he hadn't spoken in days. His eyes, pale, almost translucent, flicked over us, and I could feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't curious, wasn't pleading. It was knowing. He knew something I didn't. Something I wasn't ready to hear. "Where are you headed?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound casual, like this was just another stop on a long drive. He shrugged. "Wherever the road takes me. Just needed to get off that stretch back there." I glanced at Emma, who raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Chris had gone quiet too, his eyes on the man in the back seat, and that's when I noticed it. The tension had shifted. It wasn't just in the air anymore. It was in the car. The atmosphere had changed, thickened, like the fog outside had seeped in through the cracks and found its way inside. The man smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "There's a rest stop up ahead. You'll want to stop there," he said, his voice unsettlingly calm. I didn't respond right away. Something about the way he spoke, like he was telling me what I had to do, gnawed at me. But I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the exhaustion, or maybe it was the darkness creeping in around us, but I nodded, deciding to follow his request. "Fine," I said, my voice sounding much steadier than I felt. "We'll stop." As I drove, I couldn't help but feel that we were being pulled toward something we didn't understand. The road ahead stretched out into the thickening fog, but I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't heading toward an ordinary rest stop. It felt like we were heading toward the edge of something. Something old, something that had been waiting for us. It wasn't until we saw the rest stop that I knew I was right. The building was a shell of what it once was, the windows boarded up, the paint peeling away like it was trying to escape. A feeling of wrongness washed over me, and for a split second I thought about turning around. But the man in the back seat was watching me, his pale eyes never leaving my face, and I knew there was no turning back now. I stopped the car. As the engine cut out, I could hear nothing but the oppressive silence. The fog swallowed everything around us, and even the sound of our breathing seemed muffled, like we were in a vacuum. "We're here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't speak. He just nodded, as if he had expected this. That's when I saw it. The broken mirror hanging crookedly on the side of the building. At first, I thought it was just another piece of debris, but as I caught a glimpse of my own reflection, something stopped me cold. It wasn't me. Not entirely. I stared at the mirror, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't my reflection. Not entirely. The face staring back at me was older, worn, like someone who'd lived a lifetime of hardship in a matter of days. The eyes were darker, sunken, and there was something about the set of my jaw that made me feel like I was looking at a version of myself that had already given up. The image seemed to shimmer, flicker at the edges like it wasn't supposed to be there. "What the hell is that?" I muttered, my voice trembling as I tried to pull my gaze away from the cracked mirror. But I couldn't. My feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, my body unwilling to move as I watched my reflection. A cold sweat broke out along my spine, and my heartbeat thundered in my ears. This wasn't right. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I shouldn't be standing here. "Alex," Emma's voice broke through my trance, shaky and uncertain. I could hear the concern in her tone, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. My eyes were fixed on the reflection, watching as it slowly started to change. I blinked, and the face in the mirror didn't change. But the air around me seemed to shift, heavier now, like the fog was moving inside the car with us. I couldn't hear anything anymore. The world had gone completely still, save for the reflection that seemed to taunt me with its unsettling familiarity. "Alex, get away from the mirror," Emma repeated, her voice now edged with panic. I didn't answer. My hands were frozen, gripped tight against the car door. I was rooted in place, watching as the face in the mirror slowly began to smirk. A slow, knowing grin creeping across my reflection's lips. The man. The one who had gotten into the car with us. He was standing behind me now, his presence so quiet that I hadn't even heard him move. I hadn't even noticed he had left the car. His voice was calm, almost kind. "You see it now, don't you? You see what's happened." I felt my throat tighten as I turned to face him, my mouth dry, my breath shallow. There was something wrong with his eyes, something hollow, something that made me feel like I was staring into the void. It wasn't just his gaze. It was the way he spoke, so certain, as if he knew the outcome of everything, the way every moment would unfold before it even happened. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, my voice hoarse as I looked between him and the mirror. My heart hammered against my ribcage. I didn't know if I wanted to hear the answer. The rest stopped. "It's a place where time doesn't work the way it should," he said, his tone slow and deliberate. "You're already dead, Alex. You, Emma, and Chris. All of you. This is a loop. A loop you can never escape." His words hit me like a physical blow. I shook my head, the fog in my brain refusing to clear. Dead? How could I be dead? How could any of us be dead? We were here, weren't we? We were alive, breathing, feeling everything. But something in his voice made me doubt everything I knew. "You're lying," I said, my voice trembling. "We're not dead. We're just driving through the mountains. There's nothing wrong." The man smiled, his expression disturbingly serene. "It's the truth. You've been here before, and you'll be here again, over and over." I stepped back, my legs feeling weak beneath me, but the man didn't move. His words echoed in my mind like a chant, like the ringing of a bell I couldn't escape. Over and over. "Stop. You're lying. We're alive," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. "This is just some sick joke, okay? Just some prank." He shook his head, and in the flickering light, I could have sworn I saw something dark pass across his face. "It's not a joke. It's not a prank. This has happened before, and it will keep happening. You've already done this. Every time you pick me up, every time you come to this place, you're reliving the moment when you all died. It's the price you paid." "Price?" Chris spoke up from the back seat, his voice barely a whisper, like he was in a trance himself. "What are you talking about?" "The accident," the man replied softly. "Years ago. You ran me over. Killed me, in fact. And now you're paying for it by being trapped in this loop." It's the only way for me to get my revenge." The words hit me like a jolt, and for the first time I felt my stomach drop. I thought I might throw up. An accident. Years ago. I couldn't recall anything that would explain what he was saying. I wanted to scream, to deny it, but the more I thought about it, the more the memories slipped just out of reach. Something was pulling them away from me. We didn't kill you," I said, my voice shaking now. "We couldn't have." The man's smile widened, and for a moment I saw the glint of something cruel in his eyes. "You don't remember, but you will. You'll remember soon enough. And then you'll understand why you're stuck here with me forever." Before I could speak, the world around me shifted. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble, and the air grew colder. The fog was no longer just outside. It was creeping inside the car, swirling around us, thickening everything. "No," I screamed. "We can't be dead. We can't be." But no one answered. I turned, desperate to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The car was locked in place, and the door wouldn't budge. It felt like the world was closing in on me, suffocating me, and the fog. Oh God, the fog was so thick now, it was like we were in the belly of a storm. I slammed my hands against the glass, trying to get out, but the world outside had gone completely silent. The car was no longer on the road. There was no path, no sign of the mountains or the trees, just an endless void that stretched on forever. "Stop. Stop it," I shouted, my voice cracking. But nothing changed. The fog swallowed everything, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. I felt like I was drowning in it. Emma was silent beside me. She hadn't said a word since we arrived at the rest stop, but I could see the terror in her eyes as she stared straight ahead, her hands clenched tight in her lap. I could feel the weight of her fear pressing against me, and I knew she felt it too. That same unshakable sense that we were trapped in something we couldn't escape. Chris, in the back seat, hadn't moved. He was just staring at the back of the man's head, his eyes wide and unblinking. I turned to him, desperate to see if he had anything to say, but when I looked at him, I saw only the reflection of the man. "Chris," I called out, my voice trembling. "Chris, say something." But his lips didn't move. His eyes remained fixed ahead, unmoving. I tried again. "Chris." Finally, he blinked, but when he spoke, it wasn't his voice. "It's not real, Alex." "None of it is real," he said, the words slow and deliberate, as if they weren't his own. I recoiled, my heart hammering. "What are you talking about?" The man in the front seat turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Your brother is beginning to understand. He's starting to see the truth. This place doesn't follow the rules of the living. It bends and twists time. Everything you've experienced, every decision you've made, every move you've taken, it's all just another cycle." I shook my head, disbelief choking me. "This isn't happening. We're not dead. We're not in a time loop. This is just a bad dream, right?" The man's smile was slow and cruel. "No dream, Alex, and no escape. You've been here before, and you'll come back again. Over and over, until you break the cycle. But you won't." I swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. The air felt thick with tension, and every word he spoke seemed to sink deeper into my chest, heavy and suffocating. I turned to Emma, desperate for some kind of reassurance, some kind of sanity in the madness. "Emma," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Tell me you see it too. Tell me this is all just a nightmare." She didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't said anything since we picked up the man, and now she was silent, like a ghost trapped in the car with us. It was like she was already gone, her mind somewhere else, somewhere beyond my reach. I turned back to the man, my hands shaking. "How do we break it?" I demanded. "How do we get out of this?" He looked at me, his eyes dark and empty, and for the first time, I saw something almost like pity in them. "You can't. Not until you remember. Not until you face what you did." "What we did," I repeated, my voice rising in anger. "We didn't do anything. We're innocent." The man's gaze softened just slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Innocence has no place here. All you can do is relive your mistake. Over and over, And when you finally remember the truth, maybe then you'll be able to break the cycle. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I didn't want to remember. Whatever happened, whatever mistake we had made, I didn't want to face it. But the more I tried to push the thought away, the stronger the pull became. The memories were like a distant echo, just out of reach. And no matter how hard I tried to block it out, the feeling that something terrible had happened was growing. The fog outside thickened even more, and I could feel my chest tightening, my breath shallow. I needed to escape, needed to get away from whatever this was. But the man's eyes never left me. He was waiting, watching. "You can't escape," he said softly. "You never will." Suddenly, the world outside seemed to shift again, like the earth was pulling us backward, dragging us somewhere we didn't want to go. I tried to push the pedal down, but the car didn't move. It was like the car itself had become a part of the loop, trapped in the same cycle as us. I heard the sound of tires screeching, and before I could stop it, the car was turning. Not on its own accord, but with an inevitability that chilled me to the bone. The road ahead was the same as before. The same rest stop. The same fog. "No!" I shouted. "No, not again." But the car didn't stop. It kept moving, and I realized with a sickening lurch that we were right back where we started. We were stuck. Trapped. The car came to a sudden stop, jolting us all forward, and I gasped, clutching the seat in front of me as if I could somehow stop the inevitable. I looked around frantically, my heart pounding in my chest. The same desolate rest stop stood before us, shrouded in thick fog, just as it had been before. The same broken down, neglected structure loomed in the distance, the dilapidated sign barely visible through the haze. Nothing had changed. Not a single thing. I turned to the others, panic rising in my throat. We're back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't look at them, afraid of what I might see. Emma's vacant stare, Chris's blank expression. It all felt like some twisted version of reality, where no one could escape. Emma turned to me slowly, but her eyes were empty. She wasn't really seeing me. It was like she was already somewhere far away, locked in a different place, a different time, one that I couldn't reach. Her lips parted, but the words she spoke were not her own. "We've been here before, Alex. We always come back," she said, her voice distant and hollow. My blood boiled. The fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, suffocating us, and the air inside the car grew thick with tension. The man in the front seat, our hitchhiker, was still sitting there, watching us with that calm, knowing smile like he was savoring every moment of our suffering. "You're not supposed to be here," I said, my voice trembling. "We didn't do anything wrong. We haven't." The man's smile didn't falter. "Oh, but you did, Alex. You did. And now you're paying the price." I shook my head, frustration building in my chest. "This doesn't make sense. We didn't do anything. We didn't kill you. We don't even remember who you are. Why are you doing this to us?" He leaned forward, his eyes locking with mine. "You don't remember the accident, do you? That's why you're stuck here. You've been through this before. Every time you pick me up, you're reliving the moment when you took my life." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. The words didn't seem to make sense at first, but slowly, like a dark cloud creeping into my mind, I began to feel the weight of it. The accident. There was something there, something I couldn't fully recall, but it gnawed at the edges of my memory. I could almost hear the screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal. But when I tried to reach deeper, the memory slipped away, just out of my grasp. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, peering into a void. But every time I reached for the truth, it disappeared. We didn't. I started again, but the man raised a hand, silencing me. "You don't need to remember everything. Not yet. But it's coming. The more you try to escape, the more you'll feel it, the more you'll remember. This is your punishment. This is the loop you can't escape." I was shaking now, my whole body trembling with fear and confusion. No, I refused to believe it. We're alive. This can't be real. His grin widened. "That's the thing about time loops. They don't need to make sense. They just need to keep you in them." I glanced at Emma and Chris again, both still unresponsive, their faces drawn and lifeless. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything. I couldn't just sit here. I had to fight, had to find a way to break free. But as I reached for the door handle, I felt the unmistakable sensation that we weren't alone. It was the fog, thick and oppressive, pressing in on us like it had a mind of its own. The car was still trapped, unable to go anywhere. "It's no use, Alex," the man said softly, his voice dripping with pity. "You're trapped here with me, and there's nothing you can do about it." I felt my chest tighten, panic clawing at me. I turned the key in the ignition, my hands shaking, but the engine refused to start. The sound of the engine sputtering was the only noise in the thick silence that surrounded us. The man's eyes never left me, a silent reminder that there was no escape. "We're stuck in the past," I whispered, a sick realization slowly sinking in. This is all just a mistake, a wrong turn." The man chuckled, the sound low and dark. "Oh, it's no mistake. This is your fate. You're going to keep driving, keep picking me up, and keep repeating the same mistake. Forever." I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. We were doomed to repeat this moment over and over forever. A never-ending cycle of guilt, punishment, and despair. The car would never move forward. It would always come back to this place, this moment. And the hitchhiker, the man who had been haunting us, would always be there, watching, waiting. I looked out the window, desperate for any sign of escape, but the fog had swallowed the world whole. There was nothing beyond it. Nothing except the endless loop we were trapped in. "No, no," I shouted, banging my fists against the steering wheel. "I won't do this. I won't live like this." But the man's voice, calm and cold, echoed through the car. "You'll live it, Alex. Over and over, until you understand." And with that, the fog closed in, and I knew. We were never leaving. Not ever. The world outside the car had dissolved entirely now, swallowed by an endless white void that pressed in on all sides. My vision blurred as I leaned forward, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the fog seemed to creep inside the car too, suffocating the air with its cold, wet fingers. I couldn't tell where the horizon ended and the void began. It was as if we were no longer on the road at all, just floating in a space between places, between times. The car's interior felt too close, too suffocating. Every breath I took was thick with the heavy, stifling air, the same feeling of entrapment growing tighter around my chest. I glanced at Emma and Chris, but their faces were as blank as ever, their eyes staring ahead, lost in the same unblinking trance they'd fallen into when we first picked up the man. They were shells, reminders that they too were trapped in this endless loop with me. My desperation rose, clawing at me from all sides. I turned to the man, the hitchhiker, whose smile still lingered at the corners of his mouth like an infection. "What do you want from us?" I demanded, my voice rising, sharp with frustration and fear. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at me with an unnerving calmness, his gaze unwavering. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for you to understand. This is your consequence, your reckoning. You don't get to walk away from what you've done." I shook my head, the words lodged in my throat. "We didn't kill you. We didn't." His laugh was low, a sound that seemed to echo and reverberate in the small confines of the car. "You did, Alex. Maybe you don't remember. But it doesn't matter. Time doesn't need your memories to hold you here." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I felt like I was losing control, like the car was no longer mine to drive, like we were caught in something that existed beyond any physical reality. The road was gone. The mountains were gone. The world was gone. "Please," I begged, my voice cracking. "We don't deserve this. We didn't deserve any of it." The hitchhiker's smile widened, the cruelty in his expression deepening. "You don't have a choice. No one does. You're in my world now." It was impossible to look away from him, from those eyes that seemed to see straight through me, like he was peeling back the layers of my soul. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was wrong, that we hadn't done anything. But deep down, the guilt was like an itch I couldn't scratch. I didn't know what had happened, what mistake we'd made, but I could feel it. The weight of it, like a dead weight pressing against my ribs. Suddenly, without warning, the fog outside thickened, swirling around the car with unnatural speed. The air grew colder, and the car began to shake, like it was being pulled in multiple directions at once. Panic surged within me, and I slammed the gas pedal, desperate for movement, for any sense of control. But the car remained still, locked in place, as if the very earth beneath us had stopped turning. Emma stirred for the first time since we arrived at the rest stop, her head jerking slightly as if she was waking from a deep sleep. She blinked, then her eyes focused on me, and for a brief moment there was recognition in them. But it was fleeting, like a shadow passing through a window. Her voice came out in a soft whisper. "Alex, we're dead. We've been dead this whole time." I froze, the words searing into me like a brand. My heart stopped, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. "No," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "We're not dead. We're just stuck, trapped. This isn't real." Emma didn't respond. She just stared ahead, her eyes empty once again, and I knew. Deep in my gut, I was losing her. Losing all of us. We weren't in control anymore.
"That's right, Alex,"
the hitchhiker said softly, his voice laced with the kind of satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "You're all dead, and you're going to stay dead. Trapped in this loop forever until you remember the truth. You'll keep picking me up. You'll keep reliving your mistake. And you'll never, ever escape." I felt my stomach twist. The words hung in the air, a palpable weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The longer I tried to deny it, the more the truth seemed to break through the cracks of my mind. But I didn't want to believe it. I refused to believe it. "We're not dead," I spat, my voice barely more than a rasp. "We're not. We can still get out. We can." The hitchhiker shook his head slowly, cutting me off. "You're already gone, Alex. You've been gone for a long time. The moment you picked me up, your fate was sealed." The fog outside thickened again, swirling faster, and I felt the car lurch as if it was about to spin out of control. But it didn't. It just kept moving forward, back into the same endless loop, the same endless cycle. "We're trapped," I whispered, the words sinking in. "We can't leave. We'll never leave." I felt the coldness creep over me, swallowing me whole. There was no way out. We were stuck here in this nightmare, and nothing I did would change it. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how desperately I fought against it, I knew. The cycle was never going to end. The realization hit me like a wave crashing over a cliff. My body felt as if it had gone numb, yet every inch of me screamed in agony. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was our reality, and I was the one keeping us here, holding on to something I didn't even understand. The world outside the car continued to swirl, that oppressive fog consuming everything in its path. But no matter how much I fought, the fog was inside me too, choking out every scrap of resistance I had left. I turned to Emma, hoping for some sign of life, some spark of recognition in her eyes, but all I saw was the vacant stare, the same lifeless look that had been there since the first time we arrived at this cursed rest stop. The pain of losing her, to whatever this was, gnawed at me, a silent ache that threatened to break me. Chris sat motionless beside her, his eyes blank, his body slumped forward in the same defeated posture. They were already gone, trapped in this cycle with me, and there was no way to bring them back. The man, our hitchhiker, was still smiling, his presence a constant, suffocating reminder that none of this was real. Not the car, not the road, not us. We were just puppets in his twisted game. And I was the one who kept pulling the strings. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, frustration boiling over. "I won't play along with this anymore," I shouted, my voice hoarse and wild. "I don't care if we're dead. I don't care if we're trapped. I won't pick you up again." The hitchhiker's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with an unholy satisfaction. "You'll keep picking me up, Alex. You always have. It's just part of the script. You can fight it all you want, but it won't change the fact that you're bound to me. You can never escape." My heart thundered in my chest as his words echoed in my mind. Every muscle in my body screamed in defiance. I knew I couldn't let this happen. I knew I had to break free. But every time I thought I had a plan, the fog grew thicker, the loop more inescapable. There was nothing I could do to break it. No matter how hard I tried, I always ended up here again. "We're dead," Emma said suddenly, her voice a whisper that cut through the thick silence of the car. "We died the moment we took him in." The word struck like a dagger, and I felt the ground beneath me begin to crumble. It wasn't just the accident we had forgotten. It was everything. We weren't alive anymore. We hadn't been for what felt like ages. And now we were nothing but echoes, doomed to wander the same stretch of road forever. "No," I gasped, my breath ragged as I clawed at my throat. "I refuse to accept this. There has to be a way to stop it. A way to undo it. A way to—" "You can't undo what's been done," the hitchhiker said, his voice a whisper of death. "You made the mistake, and now you'll live with it." His words wrapped around me, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly I thought I might break it. This was my fault. Our fault. We were trapped because of a single decision we made all those years ago, a moment that had spiraled into this nightmare. But then something shifted. A small, barely perceptible crack appeared in the fog. A sliver of light like a distant memory trying to break through. I looked at the hitchhiker, my mind working frantically to make sense of it. Maybe there was a way to break this cycle. Maybe if we could remember, if we could truly face what we had done, we could find a way out. "What happened?" I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. "What did we do?" The hitchhiker's eyes softened, just for a moment, but his smile didn't waver. "It was an accident, a mistake, and now it's your prison." The fog thickened again, pushing in, suffocating us. The reality of it all pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I was suffocating in this car, in this moment, and nothing I did seemed to matter. I could scream, I could beg, but it wouldn't change anything. Emma's voice broke through again, thin and distant. "We're trapped here, Alex. You have to stop trying to fix it. You can't." Her words crushed me, but I wouldn't give up. I couldn't. "I won't let this be our end," I said through clenched teeth. "I'll keep fighting. I'll keep trying, no matter what." But even as I said the words, I knew they were empty. There was no way out. No matter how many times I told myself I would break free, the cycle would begin again, and again, and again. The car didn't move. The fog didn't lift. The hitchhiker sat in the front seat, watching me with that same twisted smile. And as I screamed in the silence, the world around us seemed to contract, folding in on itself, as though the very fabric of time was rewinding, pulling us back to the beginning of the loop. We would never leave. Not now, not ever. And the cycle would continue forever. I took a solo road trip across America. Something followed me. Have you ever heard about the guy who lives in a tent in Yosemite National Park? I can't remember anymore if I read an article or saw a documentary, but the story goes like this. This man was totally done with life. Depressed, hated his job, couldn't see a point in being alive. He drove out to Yosemite to kill himself. I don't know why jumping off a mountain was his unaliving of choice, but whatever floats your boat, I guess. Anyways, the story goes that he got there late in the day, climbed up a mountain, found a steep cliff, and got ready to jump off. By the time he got up there, it was real dark, and I don't know if he was scared, or wanted more time to prepare, or he just wanted to be able to see that the drop was deep enough that he would surely die, but he decided to wait until morning. When he woke up, he saw a glorious pink sunrise seeping across the park. The light splashing the trees, the chorus of birds greeting the day, the stunning mountain views around him, the crisp morning air in his lungs. Anyways, he decided not to kill himself. Because in that sunrise, he saw the beauty of nature, the beauty of life, the beauty of the park. So he decided, hell, I won't kill myself, I'll just stay here. If I remember right, he works temporary jobs half the year, which nets him just enough cash to enjoy the other 6 months of the year in Yosemite, sleeping in his tent, reading books, hiking, and truly enjoying his life. I wanted to start with that, just in case anybody reading has never experienced the transformative power of nature. I fell in love with it young. I was a Girl Scout from ages 6 to 16, and I know some troops just do the lame stuff, sewing and selling cookies. But my troop leader was obsessed with giving us the full Scout experience, gender be damned. We went on campouts, learned how to make fires, survive with nothing in the woods, how to pack a backpack for a long trip, how to dig a hole to shit in, which plants will give you a nasty rash, and which ones are safe to eat in a pinch. Here's a wilderness survival fun fact for you. Did you know that often, when somebody dies of dehydration out on a trail, their water bottle still has water in it? That's because they try to ration the water, to only drink a sip every hour or something. But the thing is, your body can't do anything with just a sip of water. It won't save you. When you're dehydrated and lost, you should drink as much of your bottle as you want. If you don't take anything else from this story, take that. I never drove out to a mountain to kill myself, and then changed my mind because of a sunrise, but nature has saved my life in other ways. I've made a lot of lifelong friends on hiking trails, people from all different walks of life brought together by a simple appreciation of a good, dense forest. I actually have a group of buddies. We call ourselves the Trail Hounds cause our noses are always to the ground trying to sniff out new places to hike, which is cheesy, I know. We camp out together a few times a year. Even with college, we'd rearrange our weekends, skip classes, blow off dates. Whatever we had to do to get out to the woods together. They're all like family to me, which is probably why my blood family. My mother and father, namely, were so surprised when I announced my solo trip across the country. "Don't you want to take a trail hound or two with you, Joanne?" my father asked. I had just graduated with my bachelor's degree, and after doing the math on my last tuition payment versus the amount I had saved from my shitty part-time job, I'd miraculously maintained for all 4 years of college. I had a pretty solid chunk of money left over. My parents advised me to invest it, or keep saving for an eventual down payment on a house. But I figured, the world is ending. I'm buying a van and driving west. When I was growing up, we never had money for travel. I'd explored just about every corner of the Great Smoky Mountains, but I'd only seen stuff like Yellowstone, the Rockies, or Yosemite in photographs. I thought, I'm 22, I'm done with school, I have some cash. Let's fix that. Some of the trail hounds offered to come along. Pam said she could delay her start at the lumber company for a few months. Logan said his girlfriend didn't mind if he tagged along for the first couple weeks while I got my rhythm. But I couldn't ask them to put their lives on hold for me. All the trailhounds were like that, starting jobs fresh out of school, or in happy relationships, or one Cheyenne even had a baby on the way. They had their plans, and I wasn't gonna interrupt them for mine. Besides, I figured, it'll be a soul-searching thing. Maybe, like Yosemite guy, I'd find my place in the world. Or if not a physical, actual place, I'd find my spirit or something, I don't know. I've read all sorts of books and watched all kinds of movies about nomadic life, life on trails, and everybody seems to find peace with themselves deep in the great outdoors. And I needed some peace. My maroon van and I set out from my hometown on the border of Tennessee and North Carolina on a hot day in late July. I'd wanted to paint her a more fun color, like a light blue maybe, but as a single young woman traveling alone, I knew that calling attention to myself with a flashy van wasn't a bright idea. I named her Aggie, after my dad's college football mascot. His suggestion when he saw her maroon coloration. We tried other names, but Aggie stuck. My dad helped me transform the back into a nice sleep space. Nothing fancy, just room for a mattress with some storage underneath, and a bit of insulation to keep out the summer heat, and keep out the winter cold a little later in the year. I didn't really know how long my trip would last, but I wanted to be prepared. I can't emphasize that enough. I was very prepared. I had emergency food, water and gas, a hatchet, physical paper maps, a satellite phone, battery-powered radio, jumper cables, solar batteries, a knife, first aid kit, tire chains, spare tire, ice scraper, duct tape. Hell, I brought one of those foil blankets you're supposed to use in an emergency. I was ready for any possible scenario, which is why, as you'll see, what ended up happening was impossible. I still don't understand it. The trip started great. It was everything I dreamed of when I planned this. Late night coffee at roadside diners mostly attended by truckers, long days of hiking before crashing in the van, cooking over a crackling fire under a blanket of starlight. The pure wonder as I got further and further from home, seeing landscapes and animals I'd often imagined but never experienced. It was magical. Moose, for example, they're really big, like really big, as tall as the van. I was parked off a dirt road that led to a campsite on the edge of the Rocky Mountains, eating a sandwich in the driver's seat, prepping for a hike up to a ridge to see the sunset. I love sunset hikes, and one walked in front of my car. Instantly took my breath away. I hope all of you get to experience wonder like that in your lifetime. Things got weird pretty soon after that, actually, as I headed down out of the Rockies and towards the desert. I picked up a hitchhiker in Colorado Springs. No, not like you're thinking. It wasn't some creepy guy in ragged clothes sticking a thumb out on a dark interstate at 3 a.m. Her name was Kara, and I ran into her outside of a gas station. She was a tiny woman with long dark hair and a tank top and jeans. She asked me which direction I was going, and when I said I was headed down to New Mexico, she offered me $20 of gas money to tag along till Albuquerque. I turned down the money, but agreed to the ride. I'm 5'4", so if someone looks tiny to me, they must be pretty harmless, and I like helping people out. I'm not religious, but I generally believe that what goes around comes around, and when I'm kind to someone, I figure someone will do me a kindness down the line. I won't get into her whole story, since that's private and not overly relevant, but to summarize, she was a traveler like me, who'd gotten into a fight with her traveling partner and been abandoned in Fort Collins. She'd gotten a ride with a truck driver who'd seemed nice, but then had started requesting favors, if you get my drift, so she'd run off when he'd stopped for gas in Colorado Springs and had been waiting for someone else to come along. She liked the look of me. The $20 she offered me was all she had left, but she had a friend in Albuquerque who she knew could help her if she could just get there. It's a good 5 or 6 hour drive there from Colorado Springs. But she ended up being such good company that the time passed quickly. The sun set a couple hours in, and I had been planning to stop for the night at a hostel in Santa Fe. But I figured, hell, I can keep going. I'll get Kara to her friend's place. She'd done a trip like mine when she was younger, before she met her traveling partner. We exchanged stories of being a woman alone on the road, lying to creepy gas station attendants that we had a boyfriend in the car, layering up hoodies and flannels to make our gender less obvious when we had to leave the vehicle at night. I even shared my favorite trick with her. I read it online a few years ago, I don't remember where, but when I'm camping in my van, I drop a big pair of men's boots next to my boots outside the door so people assume I have a big tough boyfriend sleeping inside with me. I stole a pair of my dad's old work boots, ones he didn't need anymore. I couldn't attest with 100% certainty that the ruse worked, but I can attest that nobody had messed with me while I was sleeping in my van up to that point. Kara got a little quiet. I thought you said you were stopping at a hostel. You sleep in the van? Sure, I replied. I mean, it depends on the night. Sometimes I stay at a hostel. Some nights I even get my tent out if I manage to snag a spot at a real campsite. But yeah, lots of nights I just drive a little off the beaten path and crash in the van. But you're not going to do that tonight, right? She seemed a little upset. I tried to ignore her change in tone. I mean, I might. Seems kind of dumb to drop you in Albuquerque and then drive all the way back to Santa Fe for the hostel when I'm trying to head west. We can stay at the hostel together, I don't mind. I don't need to be in Albuquerque tonight. I smiled. That's real sweet, Kara, honestly, but I've slept in my van so many times, it's no big. You shouldn't sleep in your van in the desert. She cut me off. We'd been talking for hours, but Kara had never snapped at me like that. And her tone was totally bizarre, like she was genuinely scared for me. After a weird, tense, quiet moment, she continued. Joanne, you said you're from North Carolina, right? And this is the farthest you've been from home. I nodded. I've been out that way before. Lots of trees. The Appalachian Mountains. You know why they're shorter than the Rockies? Because they're older. I answered, trying to understand her point. They've been weathered down over millions of years. She made a satisfied sound. That's right, much, much older. More stable. You're in the Wild West now. Out here, things are newer. constantly changing, shifting, learning. What are you trying to say? It's hard to explain. We shouldn't even be talking about it. But listen, I'm from here. There's stuff out in the desert that's not safe, and the metal walls of a van sure as hell won't stop them. Do you understand? No, I don't. Who's them? Just, please stay at the hostel. I like you, Joanne. I don't want anything bad to happen to you because you don't know the area. I was getting frustrated. I have maps. That's not what I mean. Then what do you mean? Can you just tell me? What's out there? I've already said too much. Seriously, Joanne, it's bad luck to talk about it. Don't worry, don't freak out. Just stay at hostels and in registered campsites until you hit California. Please. I sighed. Okay, fine. Thank you for the heads up. Over the next few hours, I tried to subtly ask more questions, but she was smart and incredibly stubborn. She always just shook her head and steered the conversation back to road stories. I dropped her in Albuquerque a little after midnight, right on her friend's doorstep. She was a woman named Jess and tried to invite me to stay the night, but I didn't want to take advantage of her hospitality or intrude on the two reunited friends. Kara begged me to stay until the sun came up, promising that it was no big deal, and only calmed down and let me go when I lied and said I was going to head back to the hostel in Santa Fe. We hugged goodbye. I gave her my phone number and we vowed to see each other again someday. Jess and Kara waved at me from the driveway until they were specks in my rear view, and I got back on the interstate, heading west. I felt a little bad for breaking my promise to Kara not to sleep in my van, but I couldn't really think of a reason not to besides her vague, ominous warnings. And as close as I'd gotten to Kara, probably as close as you can get to another person in a matter of hours, I didn't put a lot of stock in her fear. Though she insisted that the desert is totally different from what I know, there are people like her where I'm from too. People who believe that a couple of sticks can tell you where to dig a well, that you can tell a baby's gender by how low the pregnant mother's belly hangs, or that eating black-eyed peas on New Year's Day brings you luck and wealth in the new year. And I'm not claiming to be a complete skeptic. I'd eaten my share of black-eyed peas year after year, lovingly prepared by my mother. But this solo trip was supposed to be about discovery, and playing it safe was no way to find myself. And hell, in the spirit of honesty, I was dead tired. Getting Kara to Albuquerque had been a couple hours past my planned destination, and I'd been driving since early in the morning. Once I felt I was sufficiently far from the city, I took an exit, drove down a dirt road, till I couldn't see the interstate, put up my window shades, dropped my boots and my dad's boots outside the back door, and passed out. I woke up a couple hours later. I knew it had only been a couple hours because it was still dark out and I was still exhausted. At first, I didn't understand what had woken me up, until I heard the sound of footsteps crunching in the sand outside. I froze, alarm bells going off in my head, remembering Kara's warnings. But as I kept listening, they walked away. They weren't even particularly loud. It very well could have been a coyote or antelope or some other desert animal. I was surprised I'd even woken up. Breathing a sigh of relief, I turned over and tried to fall back asleep. But just as I reached that place between waking and sleeping, I bolted upright. A chill had gone down my spine, an unexplainable jolt of adrenaline. I listened carefully, and sure enough, the footsteps had returned outside. I listened as they walked in a slow circle around the van. Then another. Then another. What do they want? I thought. If it's an animal, it's smelled everything it can possibly smell by now. What is it doing? Then, without warning, a large thump against the side of the van made me jump. I let out a little yelp against my will, and then immediately slapped my hand over my mouth. Please tell me it didn't hear that. But it did. Or at least I think it did, because the strangest noise started coming from outside. My immediate instinct was that it sounded like a laugh, but not. It was a halting, hiccuping, throaty sound, sort of like a coyote yelping, or maybe an elk bugling, but quick and rhythmic. And it was quiet, forcing me to really focus to comprehend it at all, but then it cut off before I could. For a moment, there was only soft desert wind. Then the footsteps walked off. Sleeping was hard after that. Despite my exhaustion, I laid there for the better part of an hour, my heart beating in my ears, anticipating the return of walking feet outside. I don't know when I finally went to sleep, but when I woke, it was 9 a.m., and the inside of the van was getting hot from the sun. In the light of day, I cautiously removed my window shades, remembering last night's events, scared of what I might see. But the desert outside looked like a desert. No footprints in the sand, no dent on the side of my van that had been thumped, no police officer waiting to arrest me for illegally camping on private property. I felt relief course through me. I laid in my cot eating a granola bar, laughing at how scared I'd been, how I'd let Kara's warnings terrify me. Last night had probably just been a confused animal, or maybe even just a nightmare, a concoction of my paranoid and sleep-deprived brain. Looking out now, I couldn't believe I'd been so scared of somewhere so gorgeous. It had been dark already when we'd crossed into New Mexico the night before. Looking now, it was my first real look at the desert. The bright yellow sand was dotted with shrubs and cacti. In the far distance I saw a beautiful mesa, like something out of a painting, striped red and orange and rich dark brown. I took a few pictures to text to my mother when I had service again. Eating done for the time being, I stretched, ready to get back on the road. I opened the back door of the van. My boots had moved. A chill ran through me. The night before, I swear I dropped them with the heels towards the van, the pairs right beside each other. Now they were about a foot from the back door, facing it, as if two invisible people were standing there staring at me. It made me feel uneasy. Why would somebody move my boots? It must have been the person messing with me last night, right? Well, very funny. I quickly put my shoes on and threw my dad's in the back, hopped in the driver's seat, and peeled out of there. I wasn't going to wait to see if the prankster was still around. Though I got a bit of a later start than I wanted, it was a good day. I made a few stops at places Kara had mentioned to me that I wanted to check out. A turquoise store where all the jewelry was hand-carved pretty, but expensive, a restaurant that sold antelope burgers tasty. Before ending the day with a beautiful hike up a mesa to watch the sunset. The trail was totally empty, which I was initially pleased by. The empty parking lot meant I could spend the night there without causing any problems, and there's nothing worse than noisy tourists ruining your quiet contemplation of nature. But after the sun dipped below the horizon, and I was confronted with the reality of walking back to my car in the dark, knowing I was the only human being for miles around, I began to feel a little uneasy, remembering the events of the previous night. My flashlight had a strong beam, which I kept to the ground, not interested in seeing what was around me. I felt a paranoid itch on the back of my neck. I kept trying to remind myself that I was 100 miles away from where I'd been the night before. That was just a random run-in with a jackass who wanted to F with me on and on. But no amount of logic can talk you out of an uneasy feeling. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps crunching behind me, but every time I stopped to listen, the footsteps stopped too, and I realized it must be my own feet scaring me. Nothing else made sense. Usually, when you're hiking alone, it's a good idea to hum, chant, or sing. I'd been singing the entire hike up. It doesn't matter if you can sing well, it's just about making noise. Constant noise assures that any wild animals nearby will hear you coming and most likely leave the area. Most animals only attack when startled, so if they can hear you coming from far away, you won't scare them, they won't feel the need to defend themselves, and everything is just a whole lot nicer for all parties involved. But that night, I couldn't bring myself to make any unnecessary noise. Usually, I love hiking at night. It's a great opportunity to look at the stars, especially in the desert like this where there are no trees. But I walked as quickly as I could back to the van, dwelling on nothing, the feeling on the back of my neck never going away. When I got there, I dropped my boots outside and immediately shut and locked the doors. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling as if I'd just escaped from a chase with a murderer, though I'd shined the flashlight behind me a few times and seen with my own eyes that nothing was pursuing me. I put up my window shades and ate some cold leftovers from earlier. I had been planning on cooking a nice dinner over a fire after my hike, but now inside the van, I couldn't bring myself to get out. It was still only about 9 p.m., so I read a book on my cot by the light of my flashlight until I eventually fell asleep. I woke up in the night again to footsteps around the van. I started shaking. Something about this thing. Energy, presence, nightmare. Something about it made me feel like a kid again, terrified and small, unable to protect myself. The footsteps circled the van, then circled again, and again. I lay completely still. It thumped against the van's side, making the whole vehicle shake, but this time I was ready. I didn't yelp. It felt like a minuscule victory, but then it thumped against the other side of the van. Then the front. Then the back doors. It was like a barrage from all sides, like a group of people were trying to get in, trying to break the doors down. I bit my tongue as the thumping got louder, closer together, making me realize this can't just be one thing. It was all around me. How can one thing surround a van? After about 10 minutes, it got so bad that I thought the van might actually cave in around me. The banging was so loud, Aggie was shaking so bad. They had to be making dents out there. I gritted my teeth. No matter how scared I might be, I wasn't a kid, and I could defend myself. Mustering my courage, I yelled out, "Stop it!" The thumping ceased all at once. "Get away from my van right now. I have a gun in here, and I'm not afraid to use it." I tried not to let my voice crack on my bluff. I had a hatchet and a knife, but a gun was the one thing I wasn't equipped with on this trip. I knew how to use one, but I never took the classes or got the license, and the last thing I wanted was to get pulled over in another state and caught with an illegal firearm in my van. The person, or people, or thing, outside was quiet for a moment, and then it, or they, or whatever, made that noise again. The hiccuping, laughing, jolting noise. It was all around me, much louder than the first time. It was such a horrifically unnatural noise. I can't believe I compared it to a coyote or an elk. No animal I've ever heard could make a sound like that, so choked and wheezy and wet, and I don't know how to say it in words, but I know I'll never be able to get it out of my head. Panic rising in my chest, I kept talking. "I'm serious. Leave now." The sound died down. I heard the footsteps start to circle my car again. They stopped short by the back door. Then I heard them getting farther away. It worked. My intimidation worked. I was overjoyed. For about 5 seconds. And then I heard, as it walked away, it began singing the song. The one I sang on the hike up the mesa. It couldn't form words, really, so it was just the tune, but it was unmistakable. In broken, weird, wheezy tones, the thing sang my song. My blood froze. It had been watching me. It was the same thing from the previous night. There was no denying that now. I don't know how, but it had followed me here. It had seen me hike. It had followed me back to the van. The feeling on the back of my neck all the way back hadn't been paranoia. It had been my body trying to warn me. I felt sick. A million questions flew through my mind. We were totally alone on the trail. If it wanted to hurt me, why hadn't it done it when we were both outside? Can it not touch me? Why not? Or does it not want to? If it doesn't want to hurt me, what does it want? Just to mess with me. Why? Does it want me to leave? Am I in its territory? But how can one thing have territory that expands over 100 miles? I thought back on Kara's words. I wish she had given me her phone number instead of the other way around. I needed help. I had no idea what was going on. I guess I could call my parents or one of the trail hounds, but they'd probably just think I was crazy and ask me to come home. I laid awake until the sun came up. I took off the window shades one by one, intensely studying my surroundings. If something was out there, following me, unless it was invisible, I would see it. It's a desert. There aren't trees to hide behind, but I saw nothing. I really had to grab my boots. Everything looked normal outside. I took deep breaths. I counted to 3, then threw the back doors open. I reached down to grab my boots. One of each was gone. What? One of my boots and one of my dad's boots was totally gone. I looked around, thinking maybe they'd just been moved like the night before, but I didn't see them anywhere. I had another pair of shoes, some sneakers, which I threw on instead, leaving the pairless shoes in the back under my cot. If I got out and looked, maybe I could find the other two, but that was a risk I wasn't willing to take. I could buy new boots. I drove away, hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles turning white. I stopped for coffee to combat my exhaustion. then tried to figure out what to do with myself. I was too on edge to really enjoy any of the things I was planning to see that day. But after my coffee, my head cleared a bit, and I remembered Kara pleading with me to stay at the hostel instead of in my car. That was the problem, I realized. Whatever it was, it wanted me alone in my van. I decided to stay at a hotel that night, no matter how expensive. With a plan, I felt much better, and though I was running on only a handful of hours of sleep, I managed to have a pretty good day. I continued to slowly snake west, visiting a national monument, a tourist trap that claimed to have real alien remains, and finally reaching the part of Arizona where saguaro cactuses grow. I never knew a cactus could tower above me, could live for hundreds of years. The beauty of the saguaros reminded me why I went on this trip in the first place, to experience new and incredible things to help me feel at peace. With newfound clarity, around 7 p.m., I began looking for a nearby hotel. I spotted A La Quinta off the interstate and decided it would do just fine. A nice-looking lady with her hair in a high bun was manning the desk. I asked if they had any available rooms. "Let me find you something," she said with a smile. "Any specific requests?" "Just a standard room, whatever's cheapest," I replied. "How many nights?" "Just one." She nodded. "Hopefully you can get some good sleep." Did I look that bad? So wrecked that she had to comment on it. "I've been sleeping in my van the past couple of nights," I explained. "It's been a little rough." I saw her expression change just barely. Her eyebrow dropped a centimeter, her lips tightened. "In your van, around here?" I shifted uncomfortably. "Further east, more towards New Mexico. Just off dirt roads, that kind of thing." Her smile dropped altogether. "Get out." "What?" "Out. Now." I was astonished. "Excuse me. We don't have a room for you. Leave. Keep driving." I felt tears prick the back of my eyes. "Please, I need somewhere to stay. Charge me anything you want." She leaned over the counter, speaking to me with quiet intensity. "Listen, I'm sorry, but I can't have that here. I just can't. Get out." "I don't know what you're talking about." Now she was getting upset. "Don't lie to me. We both know why you haven't been sleeping. I'm not letting you bring that to my hotel. Get out." I tried to put on my sweetest, most polite voice. "I'm not trying to bring you anything but business, ma'am, I promise." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter if you try or not. I can see it now. Its mark is all over you. If you stay here, it'll come. And I'm not letting that happen. One of them, here, that's the last thing this town needs." "What is it?" I desperately whispered. "We shouldn't be talking about it." She bluntly replied. "Now get out. Keep driving. Leave the desert." "I can't. I can't keep driving. I'm too exhausted." "You can, and you will. Now get out before I call security." There was no use in arguing any further. Just like Kara, she wouldn't talk about it. I drove around for hours, stopping at every hotel and motel, regardless of cost or how shitty it looked. Nobody would give me a room. Some wouldn't even let me through the front door. I guessed that Miss La Quinta had called around with a description of me. I felt cursed. Outcast from society. I couldn't get a hotel room. I couldn't keep my eyes open long enough to drive all the way out of the desert. It was hundreds of miles in every direction. In a last resort, I pulled into some dirt right off of the interstate to try and sleep. My hope was that, since I was right off the road, where people were constantly driving by, the thing might leave me alone. I didn't put my boots out. I just put in my window shades and laid down. In the back of my mind, I knew this was a shitty idea. Even if the thing didn't get me, I could get in trouble with the police for sleeping in my car on a random pull-off. You're not really technically supposed to sleep in your car on public property, the exception being rest stops, and even then it varies from state to state. Maybe I'd get arrested and could sleep the night in jail. The thought was actually a little comforting, which would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. I also worried about not being able to sleep due to constant traffic noise, but when it started to get late, and it approached 24 hours since I last slept, The cars passing were a gentle lullaby that lured me to dreamland. It didn't last. Of course not. It couldn't be that easy. When I woke up, I first noticed that it was silent outside. No road noise. I guess even the interstate doesn't have very much traffic when it gets to be late enough. And then I heard them. Those stupid footsteps I had gotten so used to listening for. I immediately reached for the hatchet I kept under the passenger seat, clutching it to my chest. I didn't give an F anymore. I was ready to kill this thing for some sleep. I listened as the steps circled the car 3 times. On the second time around, it began singing my song. A chill went down my spine as I realized it was better. The thing's singing was getting better. It was still clearly not human, but it was a better imitation. What? I remembered Kara's words. Out here, things are newer, constantly changing, shifting, learning. I waited for the thumping to come. By now, I knew the pattern. It was watching me, following me, listening to me, and copying me. It wanted a reaction. I wouldn't give it that. Once the thumping started, once it was all around me, and I had no chance of missing, I'd jump out with the hatchet. I don't give a shit what this thing was. It couldn't follow me if I cut it in half. It kept circling. I waited. All at once, I heard the screech of metal as the thing began pushing my van. I fell off my cot to the van floor. That was not what I expected. And worse, the van actually moved. Somehow, this thing had gone from weakly thumping against Aggie's side, giving me a little scare, to being able to shove a 5,000-pound van across sand. What was this thing? How was it getting stronger? Suddenly, I realized that I had nothing outside, no boots, nothing to protect. The interstate was still closed. If I jumped into the driver's seat now, I could floor it. I hadn't gotten much sleep, but I'd gotten enough. I'd drive all the way to California. I'd watch the sunrise from the beach. I'd wake up from this nightmare. Frantically, I began searching for the keys. I kept them on a hook above the cot for easy access, but in the first big shove, they'd fallen somewhere. I dug through the pile of blankets on my cot, then began clawing around under the bed, waiting to feel the cold metal of Aggie's key. Outside, the noise of the van being shoved further out into the desert was deafening. Motionless rubber tires being forced to carve through sand made a loud, sickening crunch. I wondered how fast we were moving, how far away I was getting from the interstate, my salvation, my way out. And as I searched, even over the noise, I swear, I heard the thing trying to talk. Woodist. It said, sounding like 2 voices of opposite pitches trying to speak in unison, sounding wheezy, sounding choked, sounding distinctly unhuman. Hadize it. It repeated, the words getting more distinct. I realized it was imitating me, trying to say what I'd said to the hotel receptionist earlier. It could hear me even then. How closely had it been following me? I began to cry, choked by sobs, struggling to find my keys, now struggling to even see through my tears. Hearing me cry, the thing stopped its sick imitation and started up with its horrific laugh, all around me, just as loud as the shoving. And then, sitting on my van floor, sure I was doomed, that this thing was going to take me out into the desert and eat me and assume my identity, I remembered. I left the keys in the ignition. I wanted to be able to hop up there and look like I was just taking a quick break from driving in case the cops showed up and caught me sleeping in my van in a non-rest area. Holy shit. The world snapped back into focus. I threw myself into the front seat, turning the key. The engine sputtered. Come on. The thing outside was still laughing and pushing. I turned the key again. The engine sputtered. Aggie, please, for F's sake. I turned the key. The engine came to life. I gasped a sigh of frantic relief. I pressed the gas and heard my wheels turning in the sand, but I didn't move. The thing was holding the van in a monstrously strong grip. Somehow, though I put the pedal to the floor, it was able to hold me back. So, in an act of sheer desperation, I threw the van in reverse. As I floored it backwards, I heard tires squelching across flesh and a broken, wheezy, wet scream. I breathed hard for a moment. The van was motionless, engine still running. To get back on the interstate, I had to rip off my window shade. I had to look. I couldn't hesitate for long, or it might move again. It might grab me. In one fluid motion, I yanked my black cardboard shade from the windshield with my right hand while turning on my lights with the left. I saw it, laying there in the sand in front of me. I wish I could describe it to you in a way that makes any sense at all. It had skin that was a warped mixture of gray and tan, with thin patches of disgusting fur like an animal with mange. It had antlers, sharp antlers like a deer, but they stuck out of the sides of the head, not on top. It didn't have ears. It had holes where ears might be, gaping black holes. Some blood seeped out of it, presumably from me running it over. It had a little tail. Long, thin arms with fingers that appeared to have 3 or 4 joints each. They were bent in so many places. It was huge. And this is what upset me the most. Its shape was not constant. As it lay there, twitching, trying to get up, sometimes as it pulled, its torso would stretch longer. Or it would expand wider like it was a liquid, like it was spilling out of its own horrific and diseased skin. I only looked for a moment, but I can still see it every time I blink. I have a photographic memory for this one specific moment of my life. On its left foot it wore my father's boot. On its right foot it wore mine. I didn't stay to watch it stand. I took a sharp left and drove through the sand, quickly but carefully, making sure not to run down any cigarros on my quest to get back to the interstate. I don't know if I went the fastest way because I wasn't sure what I was doing or which direction I'd been pushed, but it took me almost 20 minutes to find a road again despite the fact that I was pushing 80 miles per hour. That thing had pushed me into the middle of nowhere in a matter of minutes. I drove all the way to California. I didn't make it to the beach by sunrise. The thing assaulted me around 2 a.m., and it was 7 hours out of the desert. But when I began to see palm trees, I cried again, heavy with exhaustion and terror and relief. I must have looked like a lunatic, standing knee-deep in the ocean, wailing. I was planning on going to a car wash next, but when I examined Aggie, she was spotless, like the thing had called its blood back to its body, somehow. I shivered at the thought. I had a few more issues on my cross-country solo trip, but nothing like that. I haven't experienced anything like that since, and I hope I never will. I did get a call from Kara, though. She apologized for taking so long to call me, expressing that her old traveling partner had taken her cell phone when he abandoned her in Fort Collins, and she was just finally able to buy a new one. We caught up. She let me tell her about the thing. I know she thought it was bad luck to talk about, but I also knew she was the only person who would ever believe me. She said she was sorry I'd been through all that, and earnestly promised to see me the next time she was around the Great Smoky Mountains. I said I'd do the same if I was ever around Albuquerque. She grew very serious. That's not a good idea, Joanne. What? Aren't you still there? Did you have a fight with Jess? No, I'm still here, but you shouldn't come back. Ever. A chill went through me. Oh. Don't worry, Joanne. Nothing is going to happen to you. As long as you stay away. Drive up the coast. Oregon is beautiful this time of year. You can go east from there, yeah. I grew a little sad, thinking of the gorgeous saguaros, the colorful mesas, things I barely got to appreciate because I was so consumed with fear during my time in New Mexico and Arizona. I can't believe I can never go back. Carl was quiet for a moment, then spoke with intensity. Let me put it this way, Joanne. It lives for a lot longer than you do. It's always learning, and it never forgets a scent. I did end up going the long way around. I got to see Yellowstone, Mount Rushmore, all kinds of stuff I'd only seen in movies. I really did find myself, in a way. I learned what I'm capable of. I learned to put the bad memories behind me to make room for better ones. I met lots more people like Kara, people who I came to call lifelong friends, much like the trailhounds. I laughed, I cried, I took 1,000,000 photos and sent them to everyone I knew. I think everyone should take a solo trip at least once in their life. It's the first time I really felt like my own person, totally separate from my family, my history, my friends. Just stay away from the desert. Or if you really want to see it, and it is beautiful, listen to the locals. Stay in a hostel, motel, hotel, with a friend, whatever you prefer. Just don't sleep out there in your van. And if you do, and you see a thing I still have nightmares about, running around wearing 2 mismatched boots, please don't tell me about it. The engine sputtered and died just as the last sliver of daylight slipped beneath the horizon. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, frustration bubbling up inside me. "Of course," I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter, as though somehow it could help. Black Hollow Road had been my choice, my idea, for a solo photo shoot. A remote stretch of highway known for its eerie reputation, with tales of disappearing hikers and cryptic warnings scattered across the area. The kind of place that demanded a photographer's lens, a place where nature's haunting beauty could come to life. As the engine lay silent and cold, I glanced out of the window at the dense forest that seemed to close in around the road. Nothing but shadows now, the trees swaying gently in the breeze as night fully enveloped the land. There wasn't a soul in sight. Not a car, not a light, not even the distant hum of civilization. I was alone. I pulled my phone from my bag and checked for signal. A red, no service symbol flashed back at me, mocking my helplessness. Great. Just perfect. No way to call for help, no way to find a tow truck, no map to guide me. The only thing I could do was sit there, waiting for the inevitable. The night, it seemed, had other plans. Turning off the engine, I grabbed my gear. My camera, lenses, and the tripod, and opened the door, feeling the cool evening air wash over me. The car's headlights barely cut through the gloom. The only clear sight I had was a dilapidated farmhouse about half a mile up the road. It looked abandoned, but it was the only place within walking distance where I might get a chance to wait for help, or perhaps find shelter for the night. Without thinking, I grabbed my things and began walking toward it. The house loomed ahead, its windows like hollow eyes staring out into the forest. As I approached, the feeling of being watched crept over me. Goosebumps rose on my arms, and my stomach twisted uneasily. A chill ran down my spine. Still, I pressed on, convincing myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. There was no real danger, I told myself. Just an old house in the woods. But the whispers started soon after. Low, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from nowhere at all. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of footsteps crunched through the fallen leaves behind me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. No answer, just the eerie whispering and the rustle of the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I slowly turned back toward the house. The whispers had stopped, but the heavy silence that followed felt more menacing. I stepped forward, my breath shallow and quick, heart hammering against my ribs. The abandoned farmhouse seemed to grow taller in the dim light, casting long, creeping shadows across the overgrown yard. I quickened my pace, eager to reach shelter, but my every step felt unnaturally loud in the silence, like the ground itself was amplifying my fear. The whispers had ceased, but their presence lingered in the air, thick and palpable, like a weight pressing down on me. When I reached the front porch, I hesitated before stepping up onto the creaking wooden boards. The door, hanging slightly ajar, beckoned me inside. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning with a sound that made my skin crawl. The interior of the house was suffocatingly dark, save for the pale moonlight that filtered through cracked windows, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. The air was musty, thick with the smell of rot and dust, and the floorboards beneath my feet were uneven, groaning as if to protest my presence. I set my camera bag down on a nearby table, instinctively drawing my jacket tighter around me as a chill settled in the room. The silence was oppressive, almost alive, filling the space with an unsettling stillness. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me. I forced myself to move deeper into the house. A hallway stretched ahead, its end shrouded in darkness. I snapped a few photos of the old wallpaper peeling off the walls, the rot setting in with a quiet inevitability. As my camera flashed, I thought I saw something in the corner of my eye. Something moving. I spun around, but nothing was there. My pulse quickened. "Get it together," I muttered, steadying my breath. "It's just your mind." But as I turned back to continue down the hallway, a flicker caught my attention again. This time I was sure of it. A figure, no taller than a shadow, stood at the far end of the hall, just out of the reach of the dim moonlight. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively stepped back, my foot catching on a broken floorboard. I stared, willing my eyes to focus. The figure didn't move. It didn't blink, didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching me. "Hello?" My voice barely broke the silence. My words felt swallowed up, swallowed by the oppressive darkness that seemed to deepen around me. No response. The figure remained motionless. I should have turned around and run right then, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. Something about it. The stillness, the unnatural way it filled the space, demanded my attention, and that's when I saw it. A single footprint in the dust on the floor, right in front of where I had been standing. It was as if something, or someone, had been there long before I arrived. I stepped back, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The footprint was fresh, too fresh to be left by something that had been standing still for so long. It was a single print, large, with deep indentations in the dust. The edges were too sharp to be from someone merely passing through. This was deliberate, like a mark, a message left just for me. My breath hitched, and I could feel the pulse in my throat, tight and fast. It was only then that I noticed the silence had returned, but it was no longer the quiet of an empty house. It was unnatural, suffocating. The air around me felt thick, as though it had been waiting for something to happen. I could hear the rush of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and yet there was no sound beyond that. "Who's here?" I called again, though I wasn't sure I even wanted an answer. No one replied. The shadow at the end of the hallway remained frozen in place, its shape impossible to make out in the dark. Against every instinct in my body, I took a step forward, my shoes muffling on the old floorboards. The hall seemed to stretch longer than it should have, the darkness at its end consuming the dim light like a hungry mouth. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was watching me, something older, something waiting. The temperature in the house dropped, and I felt a coldness creep up my spine. It was as though the house itself had grown aware of my presence, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. But what was I supposed to do? What was the next move? I grabbed my camera, fumbling with it in my trembling hands, the lens shaking as I lifted it to my eye. I had to focus, had to snap something, anything. The flash went off with a blinding light, briefly illuminating the hallway, and when my vision cleared, the figure at the end of the hall was gone. I blinked in disbelief. The figure had vanished. I quickly glanced back at the footprint. It had changed. It wasn't just one anymore. It had multiplied. Several prints now spread out before me, leading toward the stairs at the end of the hall. The prints were unmistakable, like an invitation, like someone, or something, was trying to guide me. Without thinking, I grabbed my bag and headed toward the stairs. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, too loud, too deliberate, but I couldn't stop now. I was already too far in. Each step I took felt like I was descending into something much darker than a simple abandoned house. The whispers from outside began to filter back into the air, distant at first, but growing louder with every step I took. It was then that I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, not my own. Something, or someone, was following me. The footsteps behind me grew louder, their rhythm syncopated with my own hurried steps. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed, unwilling to turn around, afraid to see whatever was following me. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, each step louder than the last, the wooden beams groaning in protest. The feeling of being pursued was suffocating, like something was creeping just out of sight, waiting for me to make a mistake. I dared a glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from before, but there was nothing. Just the dark expanse of the hallway stretching behind me. No sign of the presence that had been there, no hint of the footsteps that had been echoing in my ears just moments before. But that only made the fear worse. The absence of anything solid, anything real, felt more dangerous than if I had seen it, because now it could be anywhere. The second floor was even more oppressive than the ground level, the hallway dimmer and narrower. I moved cautiously, feeling like I was being swallowed by the darkness. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the edges curling like old paper left too long in the damp. The air smelled thick, stagnant, and I could hear the faintest rustle from inside the rooms I passed, though I couldn't quite place the source. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. I stopped at a door, one that was slightly ajar, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt an overwhelming pull to open it. My hand reached out, trembling, and as I pushed the door further open, I stumbled back, gasping. Inside the room was a collection of photographs. Dozens of them. They were pinned to the walls, arranged haphazardly, and each photo had one thing in common: me. There I was, in varying stages of my life, captured in moments I didn't remember being photographed. There I was in the park, walking my dog when I was 16. There I was at a family gathering, my mother's hand on my shoulder. There I was, standing in a field, staring into the camera with an expression I didn't recognize. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the photos themselves. It was the sense that I had never been the one to take them. They were taken without my knowledge, without my consent. As I stepped closer to the wall, the floor creaked again, louder this time. I turned, expecting to see the shadow behind me, but it wasn't there. Instead, the whispers started again. Faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. The sound was coming from the corners of the room, from every direction, as if the walls themselves were whispering to me. The words were unintelligible, a mix of voices, ancient and foreign. I was no longer alone in the room. The whispers grew louder, rising in pitch until they seemed to swirl around me, tightening their grip. I backed away from the wall, my pulse racing. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. I felt lightheaded, as though the air in the room was becoming heavier with each passing moment. The photographs on the wall, once mere pieces of paper, now felt like eyes. Eyes that were watching me, eyes that had always been watching me. I glanced at the floor, and that's when I saw it. Another footprint. This one, however, wasn't like the others. It was fresher, almost wet. A dark, viscous substance surrounded the print, slick and glistening under the dim light. I bent down, the nausea rising in my stomach as I realized it was blood. Thick and black, congealing at the edges of the footprint. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice cracking, though I already knew the answer. There was no reply. No movement. Just the oppressive silence and the whispering that was slowly consuming the space. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing behind me. Slow, deliberate breaths, ragged and wet. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't bring myself to face whatever was there, whatever had been stalking me since I entered this house. I reached for my camera, the trembling of my hands making it difficult to steady. As I lifted it to my eye, I thought I saw something move in the corner of the room. Just a flicker, a shadow crossing the floor. But when the camera flashed, the figure was gone. In the photograph, there was nothing but the empty room, just me standing there, alone in the darkness. "Please stop," I whispered to no one in particular. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing inward, the floorboards groaning under some invisible weight. I stumbled backward, colliding with the doorframe. My camera clattered to the floor, the glass lens shattering upon impact. The whispering stopped for a moment, replaced by a sharp sound. A growl, low and unmistakable. Something was here. Something was watching me, and it was hungry. In that moment, I realized that I wasn't in control anymore. I had walked into something ancient, something that had been waiting, patient for years. This house, this place, was not just a home. It was a trap, and I had been lured in. Without another thought, I bolted for the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. I didn't stop to look back. I couldn't afford to. I had to get out of there, had to escape the house before whatever was behind me reached me. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended, faster now, panic setting in. But when I reached the bottom, the front door that I had left ajar was now shut tight. The sound of a lock clicking into place echoed through the house, sealing me inside. I was trapped. I tugged at the door handle, panic setting in as I realized that it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. No, not locked, something else. Something much worse. It was as if the house itself had grown aware of my attempts to escape, responding to my every move. I pulled harder, my hands slick with sweat, but it was no use. The door was sealed tight, and the whispering had returned, louder now, filling every corner of the room. It was no longer distant. It was everywhere, suffocating me. The growl came again, closer this time. The sound rattled my bones, sending a chill through my entire body. I whirled around, but there was nothing behind me. The room remained empty, the shadows shifting with the flickering of the dim light from the broken lamp. And then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the house. I turned toward the stairs, but before I could make a move, the air in the room shifted. It was as if the house itself had exhaled, releasing a wave of cold that swept over me, wrapping itself around my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I gasped, struggling to breathe as the shadows on the walls seemed to grow, stretching outward, as if they were alive. The walls were closing in. I backed up against the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone. There was still no service, nothing. I had no way of contacting anyone. I had no way out. The whispers, once unintelligible, were now clear, like a choir of voices speaking directly into my mind. The words were ancient, broken, but they carried a terrible weight. "You are ours," they hissed in unison. "You belong here." I turned toward the staircase, my only option now. I had to escape to the roof, to any part of the house that might give me a view of the surrounding land. Maybe, just maybe, I could signal for help or find a way to escape before it was too late. But as I started up the stairs, I froze. A figure was standing at the top, just out of the reach of the faint moonlight filtering through the broken window. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching me. The same figure that had been haunting me throughout the house. I tried to scream, but the sound was choked off, swallowed by the oppressive air. My feet refused to move, frozen in place by the sheer weight of fear. The figure stepped forward, its outline now clearer, though it remained shrouded in darkness. It was taller than I had remembered, its body unnaturally elongated, the features distorted, as if they were never meant to be seen. And then I understood. The figure was me. The last photo I had taken, the one with the camera, flashed in my mind. It had been of me, standing alone in the woods, the figure in the background. That was the moment I had been drawn in. The moment I had been marked. I turned toward the door one last time, desperate to escape. But when I reached for the handle, I saw something in the reflection of the window. It wasn't me. It was the figure standing right behind me, its cold eyes staring back at me. In that moment, I realized there was no escape. I don't know why, but I'd share something that I still can't explain after all these years. I was 16, last year of high school, and my family had just moved to the outer suburbs of the city. Parents had left me alone for the night to go out, so I ordered pizza and watched some movies. What can I say? I wasn't exactly prom king material. Anyway, after finishing off 2 large pizzas by myself like a boss, I decided to clear out the trash, rather than having the living room stink of anchovies and cheese. So I went out the back door, only to have our 10-year-old husky Conan jump on me, trying to get into the pizza boxes in my hand. Whatever. Drop the boxes, and he starts flicking them with his nose. "Wanna come inside?" I asked him, but Conan just ignored me. It was late summer and huskies really enjoyed the nighttime weather. After a while, he got bored and walked off towards the back fence, obviously having dug a nice hole in the ground to curl up in. I picked up the empty pizza boxes and went through the side gate, walking out onto the curb where our trash cans were. It was night, but with the street lights you could see where the trash cans were on the curb. Out of the corner of my eye was this hulking mass down the road. The street lights were sparse enough that I could only see its shadow, and the trash can it knocked out onto the street. It had to be a bear. It just had to be. Then I heard the most guttural, feral growl I had ever heard. I just noped. There was some sort of base instinct deep inside me that told me to get out of there as fast as I could. Like millions of years of evolution had embedded the most basic of survival reflexes. There was a teeny tiny part of me that wanted to see a bear in the flesh, maybe get a video of it and post it on the internet. I didn't even stop to consider it, though, as I scrambled back to the side gate so fast I was setting records. That animal, though, it must have seen me, thought I looked better to eat than the trash it was going through. Because as soon I headed towards the house, I heard this heavy stomping running down the street. I don't know what I was thinking. I probably wasn't, because I didn't even bother opening the gate, I just jumped over it. High jump superstar right here. Not bothering to look back, I headed straight inside and called the cops. I know. What would the cops do? Charge the bear with trespassing. Arrest Yogi and throw him in jail with a picnic basket. I was 16, I had never run into a bear, and I sure as shit was not going to call my parents. The phone rang as I frantically ran from one window to another, looking out for cuddly bundle of fun that wanted to crack me open like a honey pot. No sign of him. The phone picked up. 911, what's your emergency? Said the voice of an unenthusiastic woman. Hi, hello. I'm stuck inside and I think there's a bear stalking me. A bear, you say? She said slightly less unenthusiastically. That's when I got my first glimpse of it. I was looking out a front window when I saw it come into view right on my front lawn. It was big like a bear. But then it stood up. I wasn't a 16-year-old expert on bears or anything, but I was pretty sure they didn't stand upright on their hind legs like a person. In the dark, I couldn't get a good look at its fur, but just guessing from the silhouette it cast, it had to have been 10 foot tall. And let me tell ya, when it turned its head to look through the window right at me, I had never felt the strength drain out of my body as fast since then. I collapsed onto the ground, barely holding the phone in my hands. Did you say a bear, kid? Said the woman on the phone. I shook my head yes. I then came to my senses a little bit and said yes. Is it just you in the home? Yes. My mom and dad are out. All right, sit tight, sweetie. We'll get someone out there right away. After telling her my address, she hung up and I just sat there in the darkness, hoping that this nightmare would be over. I didn't know what that thing was and I didn't want to find out. Hopefully somebody else could deal with it and I could go back to life as normal. If I just waited. Howling pierced the silence. It was Conan. I had left Conan outside. Scared, my thoughts racing in my head, I army crawled through the house, through the kitchen, and to the living room. My legs sprang me upwards, and I saw, through the back door window, Conan standing at the side gate, howling. I wanted to scream out, command that dog to shut up. The words nearly escaped my mouth before my hands involuntarily trapped them inside. I was too scared to scream out. Too scared to come out of hiding. Too scared to face that creature, to save my dog. Time slowed down. Conan had been a good dog to me. All the times we played together when he was a puppy, the nights when he curled up into a ball and slept on my bed, the sandwiches he stole from the bench, the tummy rubs, the head pats, the games of fetch. All of that was about to disappear because he wouldn't stop howling. No, it was about to disappear because I was too scared. I don't think I've ever done anything as dumb in my life ever again, but I ran out to save my best friend. I almost pulled the back door off its hinges, and with eyes only focused on my dog, I charged and tackled Conan. Thankfully, his howling stopped. It was only when I turned to the gate that I found out why. It was no bear. I got a full view of this creature, and to this day I still don't know what it was. I don't know how I missed it, but I saw its antlers. Its face was more like a deer, but it was bearing fangs like a bear. It was tall, taller than the gate, and it had its claws reaching over the top of the gate. Its eyes yellow, those yellow eyes were just staring at us. I didn't stare too long back because I picked Conan up and carried him back inside. When I slammed the door, I heard something crash outside. I didn't look, but I just knew that the creature had broken the gate. I froze on the spot. Conan did too. He had his ears pinned back and laid down on the floor. Those same heavy footsteps from before came to the back door, and I started to hear sniffing. Just sniffing from the door handle, and then down to the bottom of the door. Then it stopped. The footsteps moved away from the door and started going alongside the house. When it reached a window, I could see it was now on all fours, just prowling outside the house. After a while, the footsteps disappeared. The police said they took 5 minutes, but it seemed like forever. They asked what happened, and I told them about the creature, how it stood up, how it had a deer's head, how it looked at me with its yellow eyes. They just laughed. When Mom and Dad came home, they were pissed that the gate was broken. None of them believed me that I saw that creature. But I'm telling you, I don't know what I saw that day, but it was no bear. There are some creatures still out there that remain undiscovered. There isn't much to my story. I can essentially boil it down to a single sentence. I was left alone at home alone for a week. I left a door unlocked, and either something came in or I'm driving myself insane. I should definitely preface this with a disclaimer. I'm a rather nervous and paranoid person by nature, traits I inherited from my mother that have only been emphasized by a love of all things horror. I've also hallucinated in the past, although it has been previously been confined to right before I fall asleep, or if I'm extremely sick, typically in the middle of a heat stroke. My parents recently drove out to Illinois with my brother to pick him up from camp. My mother worried about me being all alone for the 5 days the trip would take, often asking me if I was sure I'd be okay, or if she should find someone for me to stay with during the interim. She even offered to kennel our 2 dogs because she knows they can be a handful, especially when we stay at our summer home in Vermont. I'm in college and haven't ever really lived on my own before. But I, like a total idiot, convinced myself that I'd be okay for the 5 days. I had been debating living in an apartment on my own senior year, and viewed this as a sort of test run if I didn't lose my sanity over the 5 days. Moving out of the dorms on my own was a possibility. The only thing was the basement. Our house in Vermont is relatively new, only 10 years and never inhabited by anyone other than us. Yet something about it had always made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I'm not going to claim clairvoyance or the ability to speak to the dead or other such BS. But after my first night in the house, I forced my parents to let me switch from my room to the much smaller guest room in the back of the house, and I would flat out refuse to head down into the basement without at least one of my parents. This was when I was 12, long before I started watching horror movies or reading ghost stories. Something about those parts of the house just made every survival instinct in my body stand up and pay attention. The basement especially freaked me out, as it had a small crawl space in one of the walls that opened up to a space that ran parallel to the room. The worst part, it's full of wood from the house's construction, and we can't even see how far it goes or what's in there. The day my family left, I forced my dad to switch out the regular doorknob on the basement door with one that locked. He laughed as he did it, and laughed even harder when I made him go into the basement and try to break down the door. After all, I was just his paranoid daughter. But I was still reassured as my mother told me, "Remember, the doors are all locked if the bar is horizontal. I love you, be safe. Call me when you take the dogs out at night." I went about my day, content in the knowledge that whatever horrors my mind imagined lived in that basement, it couldn't get to the rest of the house. I called my mom at 10, took the dogs out, and went back to watching TV as I slowly worked my way through Game of Thrones. That night everything was fine. I slept in my mother's bedroom as my bedroom door never latched properly, and I wanted the dogs to stay with me instead of wandering the house at night. Woke up every time one of them shifted, and woke up for good around 6 a.m., not that unusual for me. I didn't have work that day. One of the benefits of being head lifeguard is fixed hours and guaranteed free weekends, and so I continued my TV binge. I decided later on to make pizza from scratch, one of the few dishes I can competently make. I had just taken the pizza stone out of the oven and placed the flattened pizza dough down when I heard a thump from the basement. Distracted, I put my hand down only to suddenly pull it back as it contacted the heated metal handles of the stone. Completely forgetting the sound, I ran my finger under water, fully aware that I had probably just given myself a second-degree burn. And aside from the throbbing in my hand, nothing else interesting happened until later that night. Lying in bed, a cooler full of ice packs next to me in case I couldn't sleep due to my hand, I heard a creaking from downstairs. Annie, the larger of my 2 dogs and normally a total scaredy cat, jumped off the bed and stood in front of the door growling in a way I have only heard once before when a large man came to the door at midnight and I was the last one awake. I didn't have any sort of weapon, so I grabbed the toilet cleaner from my mom's bathroom, hoping that if someone were there, I could at least spray that in their face to distract them as I ran away. When I opened the doorway, nothing was there. I wanted to laugh it off, but Annie continued growling, even as she slowly walked the length of the hallway. I eventually called her back to me, closing the door behind us and wondering why the F I hadn't asked my dad to also switch out the bedroom doorknob with something that locked. I fell asleep 3 hours later, still listening to the occasional creaking from downstairs, waking up multiple times throughout the night as one of the dogs would whine or move about the room. This pattern continued for the next 3 days. Something would creak or groan from downstairs for a while. One of the dogs would growl or bark at it, and I would fall asleep after spending a few hours straining to hear any additional noise. During this time, sometimes I'd come back from walking the dogs or from work and find that things had been moved. I would move things on the mantel just to come back and find them rearranged again. I would leave lights turned on and then find them off when I got home. My closet door opened mysteriously even though I always kept it closed. Blinds opened and dishes were moved from their normal places. Somehow one of my dogs even got my set of retainers even though I normally kept them in a cabinet behind glass during the day. I was able to write off all these things as me just being forgetful or losing time. Both had happened often in the past, especially when I was stressed or not sleeping well. It made sense I was stressing myself out over nothing and wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. It was fine until my parents got back at least. They got in late at night, and the next morning my mom was making breakfast. Later, eating the hash browns she had made, I noticed the bar on the basement door was vertical instead of horizontal. When I asked her why she had unlocked it, she just looked at me like I was crazy before saying that she has locked it that morning. And just like that, my blood went cold as every strange occurrence from the past 5 days flew through my mind. But just like during those 5 days, I shook it off and attributed it to my lack of sleep, paranoia, and occasional hallucinations that had been growing more and more frequent as figures in black lurked in my peripheral or dashed across the room in the corner of my eye. But now I'm not so sure. This morning my brother headed to a swim meet which started at 8 and was about half an hour away. My mom stuck her head in my room around 7 to let me know they were leaving and that I should get some more sleep. She closed the door behind her and I listened as she walked downstairs and the car pulled out of the driveway. At 8:13, my door was pushed open yet again. Still sleepy, I watched with mostly closed eyes as a tall figure looked in on me as I slept. My parents did this sometimes, checking in to make sure I was still breathing, as they went about their morning routines. It wasn't until I got downstairs and realized that neither of my parents were at home, and only one car was missing, that something wasn't right. I'm not sure if what I saw was real or just evidence that I'm losing my mind. It could be nothing, but when I look out at the woods surrounding my house, I'm filled with a deep sense of dread. Whatever this thing is, real or a figment of my imagination, it's getting bolder. And I'm scared of what happens when it decides to take things to the next level. Part 2. It has been exactly a week since I wrote my first post. In case you didn't read it, here's a synopsis. I was home alone for a week while the door to my basement was unlocked, and I thought that something decided to move in. When I wrote the post, I wasn't sure if I was only imagining things. As I pointed out, paranoia isn't unusual for me, and neither is hearing things that aren't there something that has happened periodically throughout my life, though it can typically be explained away as stress or sickness. But it wasn't any of these things. Instead, the worst possible scenario was true. I was right, something or someone rather came up from my basement. If you recall from my original post, the things that were happening were fairly tame. Things moved out of their places, retainers left in reach of my dogs, etc. It's gotten so much worse since then. At first it was just things disappearing. More often than not, the stuff going missing belonged to me or had just been in my room. This lasted 3 days, and over that time I lost a worn t-shirt, a bracelet, my favorite sleeping shorts, and an old stuffed animal that had spent the past forever nestled into my beanbag chair. Then for the next 2 days, every time we all left the house we would come home to messes. One day it was a smashed mug mine, the next the tomatoes and other fruit on the counter had been thrown to the ground and squished into the floor. I had told my mom about what was happening, and she had listened to me seriously, but we had both agreed that it was a product of my nerves. She looked at the messes we came home to and said, "The dogs must still be annoyed that we left you guys here for so long." She didn't sound confident. Then yesterday happened. When I woke up that morning, nothing seemed to be missing. I had gotten into the habit over the past few days of checking everything after I woke up to see what else had vanished in the night. And when my mom and I dropped off my brother at work before going to get groceries, we came home to a clean house. I felt relieved. Now that I look back on it, I was such a fool. Why would 12 hours of no activity mean disaster was averted? Everything was good, and I felt relaxed for the first time since my parents drove away 2 weeks ago. So when my mom offered to help me walk the dogs that night, I declined. I had been stuck inside almost all day studying for a summer course I'm taking up at UVM. I wanted to get some fresh air, and to be totally honest, see if I could catch some Pokemon. While I was outside with Annie staring at my phone and praying that if a Pokemon did show up, I would have cell service, the porch light suddenly turned off, plunging me into darkness. Freaked out, I instinctually began moving back towards the door before even looking towards it. As soon as I did, though, I completely froze. Standing just behind the door's window, illuminated from behind by the light in our mudroom, was a man. He was taller and broader than either my mother or my brother, and due to the lighting, I couldn't make out his face. Frozen in shock, I only watched as the bastard waved at me cheerily before pointing at something I couldn't see. His other hand moved towards the side of the window, and suddenly the window went dark. The man's black shadow moved away from the window, and just like that I suddenly realized where he was pointing. Snapped out of my state of shock, I sprinted towards the door, slamming against it even as I tried to desperately budge the doorknob. It was locked, but thankfully my mother had reminded me to grab my keys right before I walked outside, and she headed upstairs to her room. The only room in the direction the man was pointing. My hands didn't tremble as I shoved my key into the lock. Fear and anger had always lent me additional focus that saved me precious time. As soon as the door opened, I was off through the mudroom and the kitchen, barely pausing as I grabbed a knife from the drying rack, sprinting down the front hall and up the stairs. I didn't stop until I slammed through the door to my mother's room and found her and my brother pressed into a corner, her blocking him with her body, him with his hand shoved behind him, a soft light mostly hidden. The man stood across the room from them. I couldn't see a weapon on him, but that didn't mean he was unarmed. In the light of the room I could make out his features: pale skin, muddy brown hair, and brown eyes. He was completely unremarkable, except for the fact that he stood in my mother's bedroom and threatened my family. Molly, our other dog, lay whimpering on the ground between him and my mother. Her breathing was labored, but there was no blood pooling around her. My anger at the sight before me only added to the coldness I felt. Nothing slowed down dramatically, nothing speed up either. What I was seeing wasn't far away from me or somehow emotionally distant. It just felt like all my anxiety and hesitation had vanished. I stood half in the doorway, staring unblinkingly at the man, the arm holding the knife hidden behind the door jamb. He turned and smiled at me. "Hello," he said slowly and softly, "the way I image you would to a beautiful stranger you want to take home with you. I've been waiting for this for a while now." I continued to stare at him, sure that I couldn't keep the iciness out of my voice. I let my eyes soften, brows furrow together as if I was confused by what was happening. He cooed softly before moving towards me. "Don't you dare." My mother stepped towards me. The man turned to glare at her, and my eyes met my brother's. I shook my head quickly, hoping my expression could convey something, anything to him. He tugged on my mother's shirt softly, where the man couldn't see, and she didn't move any farther. Satisfied, the man turned back to me and crossed the distance between us, walked purposeful and assured. By my side, Annie growled and crouched low to the ground, her teeth bared. "Annie, no," I said softly, attention still on the man approaching me even as my eyes fell to her. The man stopped a few feet away from me, just out of arm's reach. "What do you have in your hand there?" he asked, not angrily but playfully, like you do with a small child. I stepped fully into the room, exposing the knife to him. He tutted and gestured towards the bed. I crossed to it and dropped my weapon. "Good girl," he purred. "You know better than to fight me." I nodded jerkily, staring down at the ground. He was expecting a frightened child, so I'd give him one. "Oh, a little girl, it's all right." I heard movement from my mother's corner as he moved the last few feet between us. I glanced at her through the hair falling into my face. Her expression was twisted, as if she was torn between pleading for mercy or ripping out his throat with her teeth. His hand suddenly intruded upon my view of the floor and his shoes. He cupped my chin and gently forced me to look up at him, eyes locked. I searched his face, eyes wide with fear and confusion. He stepped closer, wrapping his arms around me, one hand over my hair, the other under my limp arm and around my waist. There, he soothed, stroking my hair and drawing circles into the small of my back with his thumb. I forced myself to relax into him, and his grip tightened as he took most of my weight. Posture drooping, my hand was about 2 inches lower than normal, low enough for my fingers to wrap around my abandoned knife. This was my chance, so I took it. It is both harder and easier to stab someone than you would think. Lifeguarding had strengthened my upper body, and the self-defense course I had taken as a freshman 2 years ago, along with a physiology course. This last semester taught me where the human body is squishiest and most vulnerable. Of course, the adrenaline coursing through your system helps the most. I buried the knife hilt deep before yanking it back out, his arms instinctively tightening around me before he was suddenly yanked away by my mother and brother, one grabbing each shoulder. Off balance, I tried to stab him again, but only succeeded in slicing him, the wound too shallow to do much. He lurched to the side, managing to break free of first my mother, then my brother. Instead of going for the weapon I assumed he had stashed somewhere on his body, he ran for the door, hand pressed against his side. We froze as he ran down the hall, steps seeming to thunder and shake the house itself. Annie didn't freeze, though. She turned from her place by the door and lunged after him, snarling like she was a feral beast and not a pampered house dog. She chased him down the hallway, snapping at him with every step. He managed to reach the top of the staircase before she jumped on him, teeth sinking into his upper arm. She let him go almost immediately as he fell down the staircase, and we watched as she ran down after him. "Stay here," my mom ordered, running after the two of them. Rage-fueled clarity and coldness having abandoned me, I could only turn to my brother in weakly joke. Annie finally learned to ha, an old inside joke between the two of us where we'd joke about teaching Annie to bite people, pointing at each other and saying, "Annie, them." We both laughed briefly, shakily, before I sprinted to the bathroom and began to throw up into the toilet. Ray followed me after a minute, having grabbed his phone from where he dropped it on the ground. The call to 911 was still running, and he began talking to the operator, even as he rubbed my back as I gagged on my own bile. "The cops should be here about now," he said to me when I finally sat back, entire body shaking. "I'm going to lie down now, okay?" "Okay," I repeated, grabbing a few towels to cover him with in case he went into shock. We waited there together. The cops came a few minutes later, swarming into the house as our mother came and sat by us in the bathroom. Eventually, we were all shepherded past the bloodstains on the bedroom floor, down the stairs, and outside to the ambulance. After they checked us over, we were escorted in police cars down to the station. They took statements and gave us warm beverages, burnt coffee for my mom and watery hot chocolate for my brother and me. I showed them the post I wrote last week, explained to them all that had happened since then. The policeman talking to me frowned thoughtfully before briefly leaving the room. In the minute he was gone, I heard him speaking indistinctly with another person, but I was too tired to care what was being said. When we weren't recounting our story, they let us sleep in the precinct's break room, huddled on a lumpy couch. Finally, around dawn, the police chief came in and asked if he could speak to my mother. He seemed unwilling to talk in front of me and my brother, but my mother looked at us, clinging to each other and to her, and told him he could talk to her there. The chief looked uncomfortable, but pulled a chair over to sit a yard away, facing us. He went on to describe what they had found when they arrived at our house. The intruder was alive at the bottom of the stairs, bleeding out from the 2 knife wounds, the dog bite, and a head wound from his fall. My mother had apparently saved his life by putting pressure on the worst of the wounds until the police arrived with an ambulance. She later would tell me that she had wanted him to live so I wouldn't have his blood on my hands, and because she hoped he would get to rot in prison for the rest of his life. Molly had been rushed to a local veterinarian hospital by one of the cops as per my mother's request. She found my mom later and let her know that the vets suspected a broken rib, but Molly would be okay and was in good hands. This is the part where the chief paused before asking my mother if she really wanted my brother and I here for this part. She hesitated, looking at both of us. We both nodded back at her. The only thing preventing us from collapsing with exhaustion was the need to know what was happening. The chief sighed before continuing on. Apparently during his conversation with my mother earlier that night, she had mentioned that 3 months ago my dad received a call from the alarm company saying that the alarm leading from the basement door to the backyard went off. When someone was sent over to check, all the doors were locked except that one which was slightly ajar. But as he found no one in the house, he assumed someone had tried to get in but fled when the alarm began to blare. The police chief suspected something else happened. The intruder had known that we only used the house on weekends and in the summer and had jimmied the back door open. When the alarm began to sound, he shut the door in a hurry and hid in the basement's crawl space under some wood. He then spent the next month living off of the food he had brought with him and what we had in the pantry. When we started living in the house again, he'd come up from the basement at night to grab food. Then, when we had put the lock on the basement door, he was angry that he could be locked out of his food source. In retaliation, he began to intrude farther into our home. Somehow he became obsessed with me, started moving his belongings from the basement crawl space to the attic to be closer to me, as well as in preparation for when someone realized the basement door wasn't actually locked. He began taking my things to add to his messed up nest. He'd steal the food I'd make or particularly enjoyed. Towards the end, he even began standing in my room while I slept. I stared at the chief in horror. Voice shaking, my mother asked him how they know all of that. We found 2 sort of nests in your house, ma'am. One in the crawl space your daughter described down in your basement, and one in the attic around where her room would be. The man paused, searching for the right words. And we found a phone and video recorder with his things. We didn't get through a lot of the footage yet, just watched a little from each night, but it was enough to get a general picture of what happened. The chief paused again. We think he was going to try to take your daughter tonight. Either run away with her or force her to live with him in your attic. He probably was planning on killing you in order to make that happen. I don't know what else he said after that. Even now, all I can remember is a vague buzz, white background noise as everything else shut down. We're staying with some people in the area as they continue to go through our house for evidence. I'm not sure what exactly they're looking for, but my mom said he's a suspect in something bad that happened farther up north, and they're looking for anything that could tie him to that as well. I hope they find something, and soon. We're staying with some people we know in the area. I don't feel any safer here than I did at the police station or at the house these past few days. My skin keeps prickling and every whisper of a noise is enough to make me jump out of my skin. I'm not sure how I'll react to being back in that house after everything that's happened. I'm not sure how any of us will react. I managed to fall asleep for a bit today, and when I woke myself up from a nightmare with a gasp, my mother was sitting at the foot of the bed staring at the door with a knife in her lap, and my brother was curled beside me dead to the world. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if writing this and posting it will make it feel any more real. I don't really have it in me to care anymore. I just want to go home. This story is true. It certainly is not as scary as other top posts on this subreddit, but I thought I'd share an experience I had about 2 years ago now. I live in the west of Ireland, and I live out in the country. Think barns, cattle, bog, that kind of thing. My house is in a region sparsely populated, and only country roads and endless fields surround me. As a 16 or 17-year-old at the time, I was charged to mind the house for a few days whilst my mother and sister were away. I had often been left to house sit in the past, so this was nothing new. It would simply mean a few days of staying in the house and eating microwavable frozen food. My family were gone for about 4 days, I remember, and the evenings then were dark, but thankfully TV and my laptop kept me from the pressing boredom. Everything was going as normal up until the third day, or should I say night. The evening was coming to a close, and because it was in the winter break, it got dark very quickly. Just in that period where the light is almost completely faded, I decided to go outside for a few moments to watch the night fully arrive. So I stood in my garden looking at the great view in front of me, free from light pollution. I went back inside after a while to see the house phone beeping. The red light was flashing on it, and the answer machine had a missed call. I pressed it, and the woman's automated voice called out the date and time of the call, and then the tone of the machine. I could hear nothing, except not the nothing you hear when no one is there. The nothing of someone not saying anything. You know that sound, right? When you say something to someone over the phone and they don't respond. It was that. This lasted for about 10 seconds and then cut off. I checked the number, but it was private. It was odd, but certainly not that bizarre. It could have been a wrong number telemarketers. Really a plethora of solutions. I remember I didn't particularly care, but something about that call irked me somewhat. Whatever it was though, I went back to browsing again. About 2 hours later, the time was around 10 p.m. or so, and I was listening to music on YouTube. I had my headphones on and was just screwing around on random sites. I hadn't discovered Reddit anyway. Something caught my eye across the room, and once again the phone was flashing. I had missed the call. I just put it down to the headphones, but regardless I went over to check it was the same private number. I pressed the button and was presented with the same nothingness. It was such an unsettling nothingness that I remember being freaked out by it. The faint crackling of a reception, but no one there. This time it lasted about 15 or 20 seconds before it cut out. The automated woman's "thank you for calling" response followed. I checked the time and date, and the call had come just a minute or so before I had checked. I went to sit down again, but before I could resume my music, the phone rang. It was the first time that I had heard the phone ring, seeing as I had missed the first two. But the tone scared me now. It was too shrill, and although a big 16-year-old lad, I was genuinely creeped out. I decided to go over to phone and check. Private number. I wasn't able to pluck up the courage to answer, and the family usually has a policy of not picking up private numbers. "Hello, your call cannot be taken at the moment. Please leave a message after the tone," came the automated voice. Nothing. It was so tense now that I thought the silence would be broken suddenly and a voice would scream. I stepped back a bit, waiting for a voice to erupt. That's how tense it was. But it clicked off again and the call ended. I was truly frightened at this. I had heard of people calling the house phone before burglaries to check if people were in, and I suspected this seeing as the family car was absent from the driveway. I walked over to the other side of the house where the road was and looked out. No one was there. I went outside and checked for any sounds of cars squealing off into the darkness, but I heard nothing except for a cow mooing. I retreated into my house and went into the kitchen. To my horror, I saw the phone flashing again. I pressed the button again, and the machine relayed another message of silence. I could swear I could hear breathing. This was the longest one, about 30 seconds long. I was very scared at this point. It cut off, and then I heard something. Something which made my heart drop. You know that feeling when you get in trouble from your boss or teacher or parent, and your heart feels like it's in your stomach? Well, I got that because I could hear a noise coming from the hallway. It was the sound of something walking up the stairs to my bedroom. Not too fast, not too slow, just of someone walking up the stairs, as if you would coming home at night and going to bed. I was terrified. I was adamant there was someone in my house. The phone calls had put me on edge, but now the adrenaline was pumping flat out. I could hear movement upstairs in my room, which was above the living room I was in now. I saw a pair of scissors on the table near me, and I picked them up, and somehow, I really don't know how I managed to do this, walked into the hallway. I could hear nothing upstairs. As I was listening to see if I could hear noises, the light shade of the hallway light started to move. The light shade has a wind-chimey style decoration of it. It's hard to describe, but if you hit against it, the pieces collide and make a clinky noise. They just started to clink together as I stood beneath them, as if some wind had rustled them. It truly sent a shiver down my spine, and I'll always remember the sound of the stairs and the light shade rustling. Utterly freaked out, I still decided to walk up the stairs, and in my head I was wondering if it was better to surprise whatever was up there or to just creep up carefully. I'm a very rational guy, and yet the sounds I heard were so clear to me that I was adamant there was something up there. I was too scared to jump in, so I went into the doorway as silently as possible. Nothing was in my room. Nothing at all. I checked the ensuite and nothing was in there. All the tension was released and I went downstairs. I eventually regained my composure and went back into the living room. The phone was flashing. I deleted the message out of fear. When my family returned, I told them of my story, but they ignored it. They put the calls down to telemarketers and the noises on the stairs to mice. I didn't believe them at all, but whatever it was, it truly frightened me. Two stories come to mind. The first isn't scary, just odd, and the second scared me for years. When I was in uni, I lived with 3 other guys. It was spring break, and they all had left to spend time with their families, and I stuck back enjoying the quiet of the place. I set up my Xbox in the living room upstairs and spread out, enjoying the alone time I so rarely got. Then all of a sudden an alarm started going off. We had a house alarm system, but this alarm wasn't that. It sounded like an old school like fire bell alarm, and there was no way that sound should have been in that house. I ripped up and down that house trying to find the bell, and it got louder and louder the couple minutes I looked for it. Every time I went upstairs it sounded like it was ringing downstairs, and the opposite for when I went downstairs. I eventually just left and went for a drive because I was spooked. I called my roommates and they had no idea. They were all out of the city. Odd. The second one I was just a youngin'. Probably 8 or 9 or something like that. I remember laying down for bed, and just before I fell asleep, I felt someone grab my ankle and pull me towards the end of the bed. I freaked out, kicking, screaming the works. It was only a split second, then the pressure went away. I was home with my small children. They were running up and down the 3-story stairs in this huge antebellum house we had at the time. The oldest was 5. This kid is not scared of anything. He came flying running down the stairs with his brothers behind him and slammed into me. Mommy, the scary man in the attic told me to leave. I had several very large, unfriendly dogs, husky wolf mixes, so I sent the kids to my bedroom and went upstairs with 4 huge wolf dogs. The dogs started growling and acting aggressive at the bottom of the stairs. When I made it to the 3rd floor, of course, there was nothing there. The dogs wouldn't leave the upstairs room for hours and growled and bristled the whole time. I decided it must be a ghost. I was left home alone. I was 12 and my mom and brother weren't home alone at the moment. I was watching TV until I heard scratching at my front door. I brushed it off because I thought it was my dog. Until it got louder and I went to look at my door and saw extremely large coyotes, clearly not wolves. I saw the coyotes trying to get to my cats. I grabbed my cats and went into my room because I knew they weren't able to get in, and looked out my window. Until I seen them wandering around my house. One saw me in my window with my cats, and it started scratching my outside wall. I was terrified. I may have been outside, but still scary. They eventually left after a few hours and my mom and brother got home. This was back when I was 17 at my parents' house. First, let me say the house isn't haunted. It was a new house when my parents bought it. That night, I decided to go downstairs after midnight to get a drink. Before I walked down the steps, I remember I stopped at the top of the steps and looked around the house feeling a very strange vibe. I couldn't place it, but it felt like not quite my house, as if something was waiting in the dark. Once I got into the kitchen and poured my drink, I saw a very large, over 6-foot, three-dimensional shadow person walk out of my parents' bedroom and simply dissipate. My blood ran cold, and I immediately got a sense that I wasn't supposed to see that. The rest of the night, I remember watching a Chris Rock special in the living room to calm down while I sensed something dancing in my peripheral. I told it to F off, and eventually it did. Up until then, my mom and I had a series of very terrifying and vivid sleep paralysis episodes, and this sighting seemed to be the culmination of that. I question everything about this reality now, and life hasn't quite felt the same since. I was in 7th or 8th grade, and it was pretty late at night. I was reading a scary fictional story about the Russian sleep experiment. I had read that scary story a few years back and wanted to read it again. I was on a website that had a bunch of scary stories and urban myths. After finishing that story, I decided to look for more and came across a myth about the Kuchisek Anna. The story said that the woman would wear a medical mask, and underneath it, her smile was sliced from ear to ear. When she took off the mask, she would ask if you thought she was beautiful, and no matter how you responded, she would kill you with a scalpel. The website also said not to say the spirit's name aloud, or else it would feel welcomed into your home, or something like that. I can't really remember that part too well. I honestly hadn't thought it was that scary. I was the kind of kid that liked to be scared, so of course the thing I did was say the name aloud. Despite not thinking it was scary, the fact that I was reading at night with the lights out and had just done something I was told not to do made me a little scared. I was like, yep, PSH, knew it was fake. A couple of minutes later, I felt my bed shake. Not a light shake either, it felt like someone was under my bed, grabbing the legs and violently shaking it. Of course, I was scared shitless because I'm from California, and I know what an earthquake feels like, and that was definitely not it. A couple of seconds later, it stopped just as suddenly as it had started. Just to be sure I wasn't going insane, I asked my parents the next day if they had felt an earthquake last night, and they said no. Then I checked the earthquake tracking website, and there hadn't been an earthquake in my area. Logically, I know that it probably wasn't that spirit that had done that, but I'm also just not at all sure what it could have been. Still, I haven't said the name aloud again since lol.
Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.